So for our interview, I want to focus mostly on the war crimes in the Second Siege.
Okay.
So, I guess before we go into that, though, I guess maybe we should discuss whether or not the invasion itself was a war crime.
Yeah.
Can we call that a war crime?
Sure. Well, there is a well-accepted definition of aggression that was defined pretty well at the Nuremberg Tribunal. It's now in international documents, General Assembly resolutions, essentially sending the armed forces, your armed forces, into another state without its invitation. Essentially, what aggression means. So there was a textbook case of aggression, totally illegitimate aggression. It doesn't matter if they thought they had a pretext or not. Believing you have a pretext is no justification for aggression. Aggression was defined in the Nuremberg Tribunal, which is kind of the foundation of modern international law, as the supreme international crime, differing from a war crime, but differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. So in the case of the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq, major war, supreme international crime, it encompasses everything that followed. The hundreds of thousands of deaths, the millions of people displaced, the destroyed cities, the destruction of the culture, the sectarian conflict that was elicited by the invasion, which is now tearing Iraq apart, has now spread to the whole region and is having a devastating effect throughout the whole region, leading to major international confrontations. All of these are encompassed by the initial crime of aggression. So yeah, this is an extremely serious war crime in a world that had any pretense of justice. Bush, Blair, the rest of them would be facing an international tribunal of the Nuremberg variety. I don't suggest that they get the death penalty, because I don't believe in it, but incidentally, at Nuremberg, the chief U.S. prosecutor, Justice Robert Jackson, gave a pretty eloquent talk about the meaning of the tribunal at the time. And what he said is, we in the tribunal are handing these defendants a poisoned chalice, and if we ever sip from it, we must be subject to the same punishment, or else the tribunal is just a farce, victor's justice. So we had a choice. Either we apply the same principles to ourselves, or else we simply say that the Nuremberg Tribunal was just judicial murder. Well, those are the choices, pretty straightforward.
So by this definition of aggression, the occupation, the second siege of Fallujah, or any other particular operation, it's all illegitimate.
It's all part of the initial act of aggression. And again, it makes no difference, zero, whether they thought they had a pretext. Maybe they thought so, maybe they didn't think so. It doesn't matter what their actual motives were. That's not part of the definition of aggression.
So I'd like to talk about some particular tactics and particular weapons that were used during the second siege. The first one that comes to mind is a tactic called reconnaissance by fire that we were using. And this is basically, if you don't know what's in a house or what's in a particular area, you shoot into it. And, if you hear something, I don't know what you would hear, yelling, screaming, or whatever, then you know there are people inside, civilians or combatants. This seems like an indiscriminate tactic. Is it right to think that?
It's an indiscriminate tactic and obviously a crime, but we should also bear in mind that the discriminate tactics were also crimes. So as you know better than I do, one of the first a lot of this was reported pretty straight, I should say, day by day. Just to mention an anecdote, at the time of the second attack, I happened to be giving talks in New York at Columbia University on political issues, but I switched the topics. And the series of talks, day by day, I just discussed that day's news. Front page of the New York Times discussed. And what they were describing was serious war crimes, and they were describing them in a positive fashion, as, gee, isn't this great, But the crimes were open. So the first act that was done was to take over the general hospital. Taking over a hospital is not only part of the whole area of war crimes, but is a specific crime. It's a crime specifically identified by the Geneva Conventions as a war crime. They took over the hospital. Patients were thrown out of their beds, forced to lie on the floor, shackled, doctors shackled. And a front page picture of it in the New York Times. And describing this kind of with, I wouldn't say glee, but certainly approval. Isn't this, look what we're doing. I mean, that's, again, everything is a war crime once you carry out an invasion. But this is a specific discriminate war crime, not indiscriminate, and lauded. They claimed there was some questioning about it, and the military gave a justification. They said it's appropriate because the General Hospital is a propaganda agency. It's giving out reports on casualties, and that incites resistance. So since it's a propaganda agency, it was particularly justified. I mean, I don't know how far back you'd have to go to find things like this. And it happened day after day. You read in the press about how the Marines are digging the rats out of their warrens, things like that kind of terminology was used. We have no idea, at least I can't find out how many casualties there were, because we don't investigate our own casualties. If other people commit crimes, we carry out huge investigations. If you can blame something on, say, Serbia or Khmer Rouge, you dig up every inch of ground to see if you can find a bone and so on. When we carry out casualties, you don't describe them. It was kind of captured by the commanding general, Tommy Frank, that we don't do body counts. In other words, we don't care how many people we killed. It's none of your business, none of our business. So there's no real estimate of the number of people killed, but it's got to be large. I mean, the Marines essentially surrounded the town. They did allow women and children to flee, but locked everyone else in. And then comes the attack, and whoever was killed in their warrens was killed by tactics of the kind you described. They're still being killed by the destructive weapons that are being used. In fact, it has a certain comparison with Srebrenica, which in the West is considered the ultimate crime. It's quite different from Srebrenica. First of all, the Srebrenica was a response, hideous response and a criminal response, but a response to attacks that were taking place from the protected city into the surrounding areas where atrocities were being carried out. In fact, the Bosnian militias were boasting about them. You can read about them in the Washington Post. And they were certainly going to elicit a counterattack, and they did. The counterattack was similar to Fallujah. The place was surrounded. The women and children were not just allowed to flee, they were trucked out. The men and boys were left, and then came a massacre. Kind of like Fallujah, but arguably more justified. So yes, by every standard, it's a major crime, and including the reporting of it and the commentary on it, which were generally positive.
So to the point you mentioned that women or children were allowed, even encouraged to flee, but the men, in fact, weren't allowed to flee. Military-age males, defined very loosely, like 15 to 55, were forced to stay in the city, regardless of any evidence that they were fighters or not. would this constitute, given the indiscriminate tactics and weapons that we discussed, would this constitute a failure to distinguish between civilians and combatants?
I mean, by definition, like if Srebrenica was a crime, this was a worse crime. Yeah, of course. It's and even if they were combatants, it wouldn't mitigate it. You don't have an invading army has no right to just murder combatants, just like that, you know. I mean, you see this in the current commentary on the drone assassinations. There's a lot of focus on collateral damage, you know, some civilians who were killed. But what about killing suspects? I mean, murder of suspects has been a crime for 8 centuries. The foundations of Anglo-American law, Magna Carta 8 centuries ago, said that any, you know, they narrowed it to free men, but the point is by now any person is entitled to a speedy trial by a jury of his peers. Short of that, he's innocent. You can't make people guilty because you say, I don't like them, or I think maybe someday they'll harm me. So the killings of the people who were targeted are criminal as well.
What's stopping anyone from holding either the Marine Corps or the U.S. government accountable for these war crimes?
It's known as a very important 5-letter word spelled P-O-W-E-R. If you have it, you can do whatever you like with impunity. And the rest of the world is intimidated. You can see, it's striking to see how intimidated they are. A very dramatic illustration just a couple of weeks ago. You remember the president of Bolivia, Morales, was flying across Europe, and several European countries, including France, barred their airspace to the plane. It finally landed in Austria for technical reasons, and the Austrian security forces inspected the plane. All of this is utterly outrageous and in violation of any imaginable diplomatic protocol and international agreements. But the European countries are so terrified of Washington that they just, if Washington tells you we don't like this, they collapse in terror. The United States is an intimidating country, and nobody's going to take it on. I mean, some do, and it doesn't work very well. And part of the reason it's intimidating is total impunity. They can do what they like in total impunity. Now you can see it, Guatemala, for example, not the most democratic country in the world, has finally succeeded in bringing to justice, some kind of justice, a leading killer from the 1980s, Rios Montt. That's almost inconceivable in the United States. For much worse crimes, I should say.
Now, what about this? I'm not sure if this got a lot of attention in the media, but the Red Cross estimated that 50,000 civilians were trapped in Fallujah at the time of the second siege. But my command actually told myself and everyone else in my unit that there were no civilians left in the city, that everyone who remained was a terrorist, a combatant. There are other reports from other people, a Navy petty officer in particular, who was also part of the operation, saying that his command told them that Fallujah was a free fire zone. Is there a law against this sort of misinformation from command to their troops?
Well, everything that happened is in violation of law. So, sure, this particular case is. But that is the definition of terrorist. A terrorist is somebody we were planning to kill. That's a terrorist. You can say the same about the drone killings today by a so-called liberal president. He says in his Tuesday morning meetings that this guy is a terrorist, so you kill him. Why? No.
So I have to admit, while I was in Fallujah, I didn't see the war crimes. It wasn't obvious to me. I knew something was wrong. I knew that it wasn't quite right, but how do you even have mixed feelings towards war crimes? I mean, how do we just not see them? How does this happen?
We don't see them for the same reason that the journalists and editors of the New York Times didn't see them. We're trained to assume that anything we do is legitimate. We're not the only ones in history to have that assumption. In fact, it's almost universal in powerful systems. But we're trained from infancy to regard the United States as noble, benevolent. Maybe it makes mistakes, but basically good intentioned, and everything we do is right because we did it. Look, when I grew up as a kid, we grew up in kind of liberal Roosevelt-style New Deal families. But my best friends and I would be out in the woods playing cowboys and Indians, where we were the cowboys killing the Indians. I mean, mostly exterminating indigenous people, but we did it, so it's got to be right. Then you see the movies in which you extol the people who are doing it, and on through from Reagan to Obama, praising the Indochina War as a noble war. We did it, it's got to be right. So it's not surprising that somebody who's holding a rifle in the middle of a war zone wouldn't see anything. It's hard to blame them when, let's say you in Fallujah, when the people sitting in the air-conditioned offices with every possible amenity around them look at it and praise it. That's what you should be questioning. I mean, how could the editors of the New York Times permit a front page photograph of the occupied hospital with patients on the floor, knowing perfectly well that this is a major war crime, quite apart from what you think about the invasion? But it doesn't matter. We were doing it. It's got to be right. And then you give this pathetic justification, which simply deepens the crime. And it's general. I mean, how many people have... take the Indochina War, the major war crime of the post-Second World War era. Has anybody been charged for crimes? The only people who were charged for crimes were GIs out in the field, half-crazed GIs in a village where they didn't know who was going to shoot at them next. Yeah, they committed some crimes, Lieutenant at My Lai. But, I mean, what about the guys in the offices who were sending them there, who were targeting the villages with B-52 raids? I mean, it's an incomparably worse crime. And My Lai was like a footnote. Actually, I wrote about it at the time when it happened. I said, it's a footnote. Yeah, sure, it was a crime, but you can't blame these guys. They're in a situation where they're in no position to make subtle distinctions about what you can do and what you can't do. Sure, they shouldn't shoot women and children, but in that situation, it's hard to blame them. The ones to blame are the ones in the editorial offices and the offices in Washington, all of us who see this and pretend we don't see it, and so on. So yeah, you didn't see it, but people in a much better position to see it also didn't.